Moving on to the war in Europe. So the war in Europe is facilitated by the Nazis and their plans on expansion throughout Europe. Now, the majority of their expansion is based on part of this Nazi ideology of the Aryan race and the superiority of the German and just Northern European people in general. And one of the aspects of that is what Hitler refers to as Lebensraum. Now, Lebensraum translates to living space. And Hitler and the Nazi ideology believe that since the Aryan race are a superior people that are destined to rule the world, he sees the inferior people around him as occupying land that would be better served feeding and housing his superior Aryan race. In particular, Hitler looks to Eastern Europe, specifically Poland and the Ukraine, and the excellent agricultural land that's there, as well as the oil reserves that can be found in the southern Soviet Union. And he feels like this land and these resources should belong to him and the Nazi Aryan people. So in the 1930s, Hitler begins his aggression by essentially tearing up the Treaty of Versailles and defying all of its resolutions in order to test his rivals and his enemies that surround Germany. So in 1934, Hitler begins testing the British and the French by defying the Treaty of Versailles, and he begins rebuilding the German Navy, the German Air Force, and the German Army. Now, this was explicitly forbidden in the Treaty of Versailles. However, the British and the French, dealing with economic chaos in the early 1930s, thanks to the Great Depression, are not willing to put military force behind their words. And essentially, they make threats to Germany. They make threats about invading and putting a stop to Hitler's actions, but no action is ever actually taken. So this convinces Hitler that the Western democracies are weak, that they will not actually physically move to stop him. So he becomes bolder and bolder. So his next major move is in 1938. Hitler annexes Austria into Nazi Germany. And this is a move that he calls the Anschluss. And the Anschluss is, again, part of this Nazi ideology that all Aryan and Germanic people need to be housed under one great Aryan empire. And he sees Austria and its close cultural ties to Germany as part of this Aryan people. So he annexes Austria later on in 1938. He annexes part of Czechoslovakia that has a high concentration of German population known as the Sudetenland. And basically, at this point, the British and the French have an opportunity to stop Hitler and to put an end to this aggressive expansion. However, again, they're not willing to commit military force to stopping him. So the British, the French, the Czechoslovakians, and Hitler and Mussolini meet in 1938, and essentially the British and the French sign off on Hitler's annexation of Austria and the Sudetenland, basically telling the Czechoslovakian government, too bad, you're going to have to suck it up because we're not willing to go to war over your land. And in return, they get a promise from Adolf Hitler that he will not annex any more land, that his expansion is done, that he's now brought what he considers his people all under German control, and that's all he wanted to do in the first place. And so this becomes known as appeasement. So the British and the French appease Hitler, they give him what he wants, in order to maintain what they see as peace in the foregoable future, right? Now, in 1939, Hitler really shocks the world when it's announced that Nazi Germany has signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. Now, this non-aggression pact shocks everyone because Hitler has proclaimed from day one that communism is the enemy of fascism. And early on in his political career, he was especially violent, especially once he took over Germany, in rooting out communists in Germany and essentially making them disappear. So the fact that he would sign a treaty of non aggression with the communist superpower, is kind of mind blowing. But in reality, what this non aggression pact really is it's a secret agreement between Hitler and Stalin to divide Poland. So Poland is sandwiched between both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And as we said, Hitler views Poland as part of the Lebensraum that is promised to the Aryan people. So when the Nazis invade Poland in September of 1939, they quickly roll through the Polish army thanks to their new Blitzkrieg style of war. France and Great Britain, realizing that appeasement will no longer work and that Hitler has essentially gone back on everything that he told them, declare war on Germany, but are not prepared to actually physically go to war. So nothing actually takes place. This is what's known as the phony war. There's about a 9-month period where technically France and Great Britain are at war with Germany, but there's no fighting between either side. Now, one of the things that makes World War II unique, and we'll talk more about later on, is how war evolves yet again. Um, we talked about the transformation of war thanks to new industrial weapons back in World War One, and how this leads to trench warfare and a war of attrition. Well, in the 2 decades between World War One and World War Two, the German army essentially begins redesigning its military in order to not get bogged down in a trench style of warfare again. And what they develop is what's known as Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Now, the way that Blitzkrieg works is the German army pinpoints one or two weak points within an enemy defense, and they hit that particular point, as you can see on the left, in force with massive amounts of armored vehicles, tanks, troop carriers, as well as precise dive bombers and air support. And essentially, what they do is they force their way through a single point in the enemy line. Once that point is open, the entire German, well, not the entire German army, but a huge portion of the German military forces its way through the line, expands and fans out behind the enemy, and this allows them to envelop enemy units, which are then either destroyed or quickly surrender. While they're doing this, the main point of the spear, which is the heavy armored column with the air support, continues to push deeper and deeper into enemy territory. And this completely revolutionizes the way that wars are fought. This is essentially still studied in military tactics today and is still a primary tactic in modern conventional warfare. So, because Great Britain and France are not ready for war, this begins the 9-month phony war period where the British and the French essentially just build up their defenses, begin making preparations for war, begin to shore up the border with France. In the meantime, Hitler does not sit still. He takes advantage of this phony war period and moves on to conquer Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. So by this point, the Germans control the majority of Northern Europe. So in the spring of 1940, now that Hitler has shored up essentially the rear of his flank, he turns all of his attention on France. And in 1940, the Nazis roll into France using Blitzkrieg and basically just completely destroy these massive defense fixtures known as the Maginot Line that the French had been building for the past 20 years. Unfortunately for the French, they expected World War II to be fought the same way that World War I was. They had built defenses based on a trench warfare strategy. So, yet again, war has evolved. Certain people involved in the war are still trying to fight that war in the way that wars have been fought in the past. The Germans, however, have evolved and moved into a new, more mobile system of war. So, with Blitzkrieg in their back pocket, the Nazis roll over France, and France surrenders to Germany within a month, which is, again, one of the most shocking events of the 20th century is the lack of French defense. Now, with France under control, Germany can now begin plans for invading Great Britain. They begin massive air raids on the British islands. However, thanks to the British Air Force as well as material and financial support from the United States, they're unable to mount an invasion of Great Britain, right? So, in the meantime, as Germany is trying to bomb Great Britain into submission, German and Italian troops invade the French and the British colonies in North Africa, basically attempting to roll into the Middle East and gain control of all of that oil. Fortunately for the British, they are able to turn them back in Egypt at the Battle of Alamein. Otherwise, Germany would have had control of essentially all of North Africa, all of the oil resources of the Middle East, and would have essentially created a European fortress where the Allies would have had really no entry point to being able to penetrate their defenses in Europe, right? Now, in 1941, however, Hitler makes a classic mistake. He bites off more than he can chew. So in 1941, Hitler begins a surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. Basically, again, going back on his word, tearing up the non aggression treaty with the Soviets. Now, anybody who studies Hitler's actions up to this point, up to 1941, should have seen this coming. Again, Hitler and the Nazi ideology loathes communism. They consider communism a mortal enemy of fascism because it denies the strength and the superiority of cultural and racial lines. So the fact that Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 really shouldn't have been that big of a surprise, but it does take the Soviet Union by complete surprise. Basically, within 6 months of Blitzkrieg, the German army is within 100 miles of Moscow. Unfortunately, Hitler, apparently not a student of history, makes the same mistake as Napoleon did. He unfortunately allows his army to get caught in Russia in the winter. And because of winter and because of the fact that the army is moving so quickly thanks to Blitzkrieg, his supply lines are now overextended. Troops do not have winter clothes. They do not have the necessary food and materials to survive a Russian winter. Basically, everything bogs down. And in the middle of 1942, the Russians are able to defeat the German army at the Battle of Stalingrad. This is the beginning of the end for the Nazis. Once the massive resources and manpower of the Soviet Union gets rolling, Germany is basically on the retreat for the rest of the war. Now, the United States gets involved in Europe, but much later in the game. Their primary focus is on the war in the Pacific against Japan. However, because Germany has an alliance with Japan, After Pearl Harbor, the Germans, again, not very brightly, declare war on the United States, and they begin using their submarine fleet, known as U boats, to begin sinking U.S. ships that are delivering supplies, materials, money to Great Britain and to the other allies. This essentially seals their death warrant. Once the United States and their massive resources and their massive production and manufacturing capability gets to its full potential, there is essentially no stopping it. World War One should have taught Germany that lesson, but it didn't. So once U.S. arms began flowing into Great Britain, U.S. troops began landing in North Africa in 1942 to begin pushing out the Germans and the Italians. They land in Italy in 1943 and then land in Normandy, France in 1944. And from this point on, you have the Americans leading the advance from the west. The Soviet Union is closing in from the east. Berlin is surrounded in April of 1945. Hitler commits suicide on April 30th as American and Soviet troops enter Berlin, and then the German army officially surrenders on May 8th. War in Europe is over.